Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third of our 4 discussions on teaching and education in the climate change arena. My name is Beth Martin. I'm a teaching professor at Washington University and director of our climate change program. And I've also been honored to serve with Kelly Eskew as co-chair of the Teaching and Education Subcommittee. Our goal over these 4 weeks in our subcommittee has been to identify, understand, and address education needs around capacity building in both the academy and the community, what all college graduates and what students entering the market as climate experts need to understand about climate, and finally, how we ensure that our necessary transition to carbon neutrality can be just and fair. So if you've attended either or both of our previous sessions, then welcome back. We're glad to see you again. If not, welcome, and we're glad you're here to be a part of our conversation today. So if you please remember that our workshop will be or is being recorded. As we get started, I want to go over a couple of logistics. So first, when you registered, you might have seen something that referred to active or listening participants. We've decided to simplify that a little bit. It was more confusing. If you want to actively engage, what we ask you to do is leave on your video. You can share information and ask questions in the chat. If you'd like to just sit back and listen, you can just turn off your video and be muted and just sit back and listen and enjoy the conversation. Before we get going, I want to do a couple of Zoom tips. So if we want to go to the next slide. Yes, so for Zoom tips, we'll quickly go through the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. All of you have been joined on muted. If you'd like to actively engage, please unmute yourself when you enter your breakout session so that you can participate. We will be using breakout sessions. The first part will be discussion amongst all of us, and then we'll go into breakout sessions. So just as a heads up on that. You can participate through the chat box, sharing your thoughts and asking questions of our speakers and panelists. To open the chat box, just click on the chat button on the toolbar. In order to raise your hand to participate in the breakout sessions, or when we come back together, click participants to open the participant list and select the option to raise your hand. Though I will say our breakout groups have been a great size for just kind of an open conversation. Feel free to also participate non-verbally by using the reactions feature during your workshop. And for everyone joining us, you can select your view of gallery where you can see all the participants in small video boxes, or speaker view where you just are focused in on the primary speaker in a larger video box. So to get us going, the first thing that I would like us to do, if you don't mind, it'll give us all a sense of kind of where we're all coming from. I am just dropped in the chat a link to a Menti page. And what we would like the panelists and I would like you to do is go to this page quickly and enter a response to this question. What is your relationship or interest in environmental education programs and their students? We'd like to kind of get a sense of the makeup of who's part of our discussion in this workshop. So if everybody can go to the chat real quick, click on that link and enter it in, and then I will share my screen in just a second. And we can get a sense of where everyone's coming from.
Beth, I don't see a link.
I just put it in the chat. Oh, maybe because I sent it to Beth Mercer Taylor privately, so she's the only one that got it.
And I have a training I'm going to share with everyone, and that's why I was privately messaging Beth, no secrets. And I'm on the Mentimeter, and it's easy.
Yay. Okay, and so I've got my screen shared. So we have students, we have a professor teaching in water quality, Director of Environmental Science and Sustainability Program, Sustainability Education, Professor of Business. Let's see, do we have a couple more? K-12 community member, doctoral student in social work. Environmental education. So this is great. And this is, this, when we were talking with our panelists and wondering, where is our audience coming from? This is definitely representative of what we've been seeing, and we really appreciate everyone being here and being willing to contribute and be part of this conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'd like to introduce you to our panelists that will be talking today. And I have to say, one of the things that we're thinking about and tackling today is this question of, for our students that really have already decided they want to focus in on sustainability and climate change, what are we teaching them, and what's important for them to know and learn when they leave the academy? So in thinking in that kind of context. And so the expert panel we have today in some ways is kind of like my dream team of the different types of skills we'd like to see and be able to help our students develop and share. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to have them share a little bit about their thoughts of a question that Dr. Wildcat posed in his plenary, thinking about how we're starting to build models of what he referred to as systems of life enhancement will look like, right? But really thinking about that broadly in terms of this question of, as we think of systems in that way, what do we need to be teaching and sharing with our students? So joining us are Dr. Daniel Wildcat, who I hope each of you were able to hear just now. He's a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma and an Indigenous and American Indian Studies faculty member at Haskell Indian Nations University. In 1994, he helped form a partnership with the Hazardous Substance Research Center at Kansas State to create the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center as a nonprofit Native American research center to facilitate technology transfer to tribal governments and Native communities, transfer of accurate environmental information to tribes, and research opportunities to tribal college faculty and students throughout the US. He's co-author of the Southern Great Plains chapter of the 4th National Climate Assessment, and his most recent book, Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge, suggests current environmental issues will require the exercise of indigenous ingenuity, and wisdom if mankind is to reduce environmental damage underway. Next, we have Cassie Power. Cassie is the Associate Director for Faculty and Academic Engagement at the Gephardt Institute. Cassie leads the vision and strategic expansion of curricular community engagement at Washington University. In this capacity, she works with faculty and leadership across all 7 academic schools at WashU, both undergraduate and graduate levels, to assure robust and high quality opportunities for faculty to build civic and community engagement into their courses, right? So Cassie does a little bit of what Dr. Wildcat was talking about it. How do we get outside? Being outside of those classrooms. Next, we have Sarah Minzy. Sarah is a social ecological systems scientist who studies community-based natural resource management and environmental governance with a particular emphasis on urban forest management. In her role as faculty at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, she serves as the director for the integrated program in the environment and administrative director for the IU Research and Teaching Preserve. And Sarah really kind of tackles those issues and questions of how do you look across silos and talk with people from different disciplines and different areas. And last but not least, we have Liliana Soderenk. Liliana is a second-year student pursuing a BA in Environmental Science and a certificate in Sustainability Studies at Northwestern University. Born and raised in Manhattan, Liliana's interest in environmentalism extends particularly to creating practical and long-term solutions for urban environments and lifestyles. She's passionate about sustainability, especially as it relates to economics, policy, and anticipates working with both corporate and political environmental initiatives in her career. So Liliana is bringing to us this student perspective and student expectations to think about as we have this conversation. So what I'd love to do is to have each of you share a couple of minutes your thoughts on our guiding question, thinking about what are those core competencies, what do we owe to our students as we prepare them to be climate champions, and thinking about building models of life enhancement. So I'd like to start. I'll go first with Dr. Wildcat. And if each of you can take, just 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll open for questions before we go into breakout groups.
Well, since people have heard me, let's see, can you hear me now? Okay. I think that one of the things that is really important is just to remember that we are talking about the need for systemic change. People talk a lot about systemic change now, but not to let people get overwhelmed. The system and systems are big institutions, big organizations that have a long history. They're deeply embedded and grounded in the society we work in. So how do you advance systemic change? I think the thing that I think every environmental science student focusing on climate change needs to understand is that we got into this mess as a result of our dependence on carbon energy, on using, this kind of repository of fossil fuels we've had, and extracting those and burning those up. And I think that has to be, point one, and then you build off of that. So you start thinking about what are the opportunities for renewable energies? What are the opportunities for thinking about fundamental design issues? How could I build a community in an urban landscape where I don't need to own a car? I don't need to use a car. Now, this is kind of interesting because, you can go to very old cities in the world and you find out that people who live in the city don't have cars. Well, they don't need a car. It's a walkable, or they've got public transportation, to address, their transportation needs. I think as we start thinking about places like St. Louis, places like Kansas City, okay, we've got tremendous opportunities for urban sort of infill development, but really thinking very differently about what those communities can look like, how they're designed, what's there. And I think so there's a lot of opportunities for people who are interested in systems and design, because I think, these are really things that people are mindful of now. So I think number one, we've got to be looking at renewable energy. Two, we've got to be thinking about building in a way where we do not use as much energy in general, external to that which was in our own body. And I think there's really going to be some incredible opportunities. And this is for people who are thinking about design issues, thinking about systems issues, and then putting that work, going to work right on the ground in their community, whether it's a community garden, whether it's thinking about zoning issues and how we ought to zone certain areas of a city or town or county. Those are really practical issues, and they go to the heart of sort of changing the system that we're in.
Thank you. So now I'd like to shift, and Cassie, can I ask you to share some of your thoughts?
I would be happy to. So first, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Wildcat. I really enjoyed what you shared with us this morning, and it really resonated with me. And I actually see it reflected in a lot of what I'm about to say. So I feel like I'm going to be a little repetitive, but maybe it's good for us to hear things more than once. So I think that it's important that we teach students to get out of the classroom and to start to think about that problem-based learning that people have already talked about. Our problems don't happen in silos, and so we need to be able to interact with the world in a way that allows us to appreciate and learn from the complexity of it. And so my role is to work with folks who are interested in doing community engaged learning. And so basically what this means is that students are doing that problem-based learning, but they're doing it in community with folks from outside of, in my context, the university, but outside of schools. So working together with community members or with community leaders to think about the things that we're wanting to address in our communities, and being able to learn with and from those community leaders, in addition to the teachers who they encounter in the room. And I'm going to talk about 4 competencies that I think have not been attended to in super intentional ways in our traditional schooling, that I think are really important to working towards learning for these systems of life enhancement. So those 4 competencies that I think this kind of community engaged learning can really help us with, that I think our students are really going to need, are learning about interdependence, learning about how to actually listen, learning flexibility and tolerance for ambiguity, and centering equity. So to start with interdependence, our schooling systems are set up such that students are expected to try to outperform others, right? It's a very competitive system, and the person who does the best wins, if you will, right? But this is not the kind of learning that is going to help us get to these systems of life enhancement. We need to teach students how to not stand out, but to really how to be with others, how to work together with others, to also identify the strengths in others, so that everyone can bring their best from their own places to be able to work together to address issues. So I think that community engaged courses really help with that. And I think it moves us to what Dr. Wildcat talked about, from thinking about individual rights to thinking about more of those ways in which we are relatives. And so that's the first one, interdependence, teaching students how to be with rather than how to stand out. I think the second thing is really about listening. So if you look at a lot of the competencies that we're teaching students how to write. So we're talking about written communication. We talk about verbal communication as another thing that we teach. And I wonder what it would mean if we really centered listening competencies. So if instead of having a final paper, we had a final listening assignment, right? That was scaffolded across a semester, where we had to learn to listen to other people, build those listening skills, and then have some sort of, that was my warning to myself that I'm going too long. How do we actually scaffold learning around listening? We just assume that people learn how to listen, but we don't actually teach it. So I think that would be another thing. And then I'll quickly say, I think that community engaged learning is really good at helping students learn how to tolerate ambiguity. And so I think that this goes back to what Dr. Wildcat said about insulated ignorance. Like a typical syllabus, or like our Common Core, they say that learning goes from A to B, and it's predictable, and we know what we need when we start, right? But as we are out in the world, that's not a lot of the learning that we need to do. We need to learn how to be flexible. We need to learn how to go where the path is leading us. We need to learn from the detours, right? A to B isn't always the best way for us to go. There might be learning that's important for us to do on the side path. And so I think when you're working with community, it requires that we be a little bit more flexible, and that we look for the learning where it's presenting itself to us. And then I'll just lastly say, I think it's important that we do this by centering equity. I think that when we center the margins, there's a perspective and a knowledge and a wisdom that we haven't been tapping into. And so if we want to be able to learn in new ways, then we have to be able to look at those folks who have been at the margins, who have things to teach us. And I think also paying attention to intersectionality and also relationships of power. I'll stop there because I've gone too long.
Cassie, thank you so much. And every time that I hear you, and since I know you, I can say this, every time I hear you, I learn new things, and I really just appreciate and value that. And I'm definitely thinking about some competencies I haven't considered previously. Shifting, Liliana.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to begin by expressing how honored and humbled I am to be on this panel with such brilliant individuals and my personal role models as I aspire to a career in environmental sciences and climate justice. And I'm really excited by efforts like the Midwest Climate Summit. So I'm very honored to be here. So as a student, I feel the urgency of climate change every day in my environmental science, sustainability, economics, philosophy classes. And last year in one of my sustainability classes, I heard the figure that 8 years from 2019 was all the time we have left to make serious changes. And I was wondering, how are we going to make it in time if the majority of our climate leaders are still in college or haven't even graduated high school yet? So there's a lot of talk in my classes about projections by the IPCC and scary numbers. We have to increase nuclear by this much if we don't cut our consumption by this many kilowatt hours per day. But if we use nuclear as a transition fuel, and we're also building cars that weigh 3 pounds and have no drag and sequester carbon at the same time, and it gets overwhelming and confusing talking in all of these hypotheticals. So a professor of mine last year had us conduct this wonderful exercise in which we created a plan for net zero by 2050. And he gave us 4 calculators where we manipulated values corresponding to food, water, transport, and residential consumption. And in doing my independent research and reading, all these various sources and understanding, I was able to come to my own understanding of how interdependent all these variables are. And on a personal scale, what kinds of reductions would I be willing to make, and what kind of sacrifices would I be willing to make? So it became very clear to me just how complex and profound modern sustainability challenges are. Another point is that, as Dr. Wildcat mentioned in his keynote presentation, that understanding our human role in the systems we've created is integral to developing a sense of humility and understanding our responsibility to the species that we share the planet with, the minority and marginalized communities that suffer most as a result of environmental degradation, as Dr. Power was talking about, equity being an essential core competency of our environmental science students. And also understanding that anthropocentric, biocentric, and ecocentric perspectives of environmental science need not be mutually exclusive. And I think this is a concept that up and coming climate and environmental experts need to be able to communicate to people who are also in control of our climate future. So I think effective teaching would allow us to engage in mock discourse, practice speaking to somebody who might have a different perspective. For example, I would play the role of a businesswoman and my peer would play the role of an environmental scientist, communicating to the businesswoman why environmental science and caring for the environment is in her best interest, while the person playing the businesswoman would understand the businesswoman's perspective and her stake in the environment and why she might not be interested in certain kinds of policies, and understanding where the other person is coming from and being able to speak to them about the intersectional importance of climate change. And just like the summit is doing, I would also like to see efforts bring together inter-university perspectives, not only within the Midwest, but on a global scale. I think we have a lot to learn from the cultural tenets of countries like Costa Rica and Switzerland, where sustainability has become a no-brainer for people living in those countries, and that we can extrapolate cultural and social lessons for our own consumption-driven society from just observing and speaking with students and experts in other parts of the world. But most importantly, through my studies and my experiences, I want to be prepared for the worst case scenario, that I want a deep understanding of all dimensions of climate science and environmental science. And I've noticed in my own curriculum that there are some redundancies across core courses and not enough emphasis on practical skill development. And because I feel like I'm on a clock, I don't want to waste any time relearning about convection currents, as important as they are to climate dynamics, in each of my 3 core courses, when I could be learning about how to hack somebody who doesn't believe in climate change. I say that with heavy air quotes, and understanding the statistics and the social dynamics that make the disproportionate impacts on minority communities of climate change so profound, and how to market sustainability to consumers as the obvious and trendy choice for such a consumption-driven society. Yeah, and I'll close by saying that I'm really grateful to see all the faces in this Zoom room, and it's really reassuring for me to see that there are many educators and leaders as engaged in the field and working tirelessly to ensure that the leaders of tomorrow are prepared. So thank you.
Liliana, you're welcome. And thank you for being here. We're really honored to both. And Liliana, I must say, was on our subcommittee and was a strong voice in helping us prepare not just today, but all of the sessions that we've done through the Teaching and Education Work Group. And we really appreciate having your voice and perspective as we helped kind of develop and shape everything. So thank you very much for your time and for being here with us. So next, I would like to go to Sarah and let Sarah share with us her thoughts.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you. I run an academic program at Indiana University, a BA in Environmental and Sustainability Studies, and another program, a BS in Environmental Science. And my experience doing that for the last 6 years has been an interesting one in terms of trying to break down silos. So I think that I draw on that quite a bit to talk about, to answer the question that was posed to us today. But I think it's important that I share with you sort of my overarching perspective here, which is that I think that that sustainability learning outcomes have been well developed over the last decade or two. We, of course, all probably have read Week and the competencies that have been presented there. I wanted to share, in case folks didn't see this year, a new study was done by Katja Brundiers and some other folks who are associated with the National Council for Science and the Environment. This study took place over the last several years. It was a Delphi study with 14 international experts in sustainability education on the framework of key competencies in sustainability, which were presented through the Week article. It's the most frequently cited framework, but they updated that framework through this Delphi study and added a couple competencies that I think are very, very relevant. I'm going to post the citation for you to see that new study that was published in Sustainability Science this past summer. So saying all of that, I want to just point out that I think we could probably relatively quickly come to consensus on what the competencies need to be for our students who are trying to address climate solutions. And so I think what I can bring to this from that perspective is thinking a little bit more about design in our institutions that facilitate our students getting those learning outcomes or objectives or competencies. And so that's kind of where I'm going to go with what I want to say. But I needed to just point out that I believe that those competencies are well developed. So if we're trying to meet those, then from my perspective, I think that it's important that we are pursuing joint academic programs across units within one institution. And to do that well, my experience has been that you have to have a neutral program office that works between the different schools, particularly in this responsibility center budgeting framework that most of our institutions have, where we're competing with one another. You need to remove that competition and have these units working together. Those joint programs can then pull coursework from many different disciplines. So developing an interdisciplinary program meeting those learning objectives that I think all of us would probably list as something that these students need to have. So beyond that, which is not an easy task, but I'm happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk more about that, because that's what I've really created and sustained over the last several years at IU. The only joint programs on campus at the undergraduate level are these environmental and sustainability programs. But beyond that, I think we need to build scaffolding for our students that actually, playing off of Dr. Wildcat's language, that builds relatives for us, or networks. And I think that those happen inside of a campus, so intra-campus networks, but also from campus to community. And I think that they build off of one another. So inter-campus networks, from my perspective, really are about not only these academic programs, working across academic programs to build joint programs, but also academic programs to non-academic units on a campus. So real connections where there are credit hours given to students by working with an Office of Sustainability in an internship, right? That helps them build up their credit hours for their academic program. Those kinds of arrangements are inter-campus arrangements that make a difference and put students in practical situations, real world situations outside of the classroom, and then build their network, build relatives for them, right? And then we need to build out of campus to the community, of course. And those kinds of programs, I think, it takes a lot of effort in terms of development and networking on the part of administrators or program coordinators, right? But the benefits are so worth it in terms of truly having students meet the learning objectives, and so really having learning outcomes, right? I just want to tell a story of the scaffolding at IU. So we run a program out of my office called the Summer Experience in Sustainability in the Environment. It's a high school program, high school student focused program to bring high schoolers who are underrepresented minority students to our campus to experience all of the environmental and sustainability programming that we have on campus. So they're one day out in the field doing environmental science techniques in, aquatic, data collection, right? And then the next day they'll be in the fine arts, building, dyeing cloth with indigo, and learning about the sustainability of sustainability issues in the fashion industry, right? So it really runs the gamut. They see all the disciplines. We can have a student come to that program, have them then see what they can study at IU. So then they come and they join one of our academic programs in environmental or sustainability studies. From there, we have students doing these co-curricular things that are really giving them credit in the academic world, either a sustainability internship with our Office of Sustainability, or doing a research experience that we run called Sustainability Scholars. Both of those, they're more easily accessible to those students who have been a part of that high school program, right? We know them, we've helped them along to understand how they can put their application in. So that's this relative, right? This network that we've built. From those co-curricular opportunities, whether it be research or practice with the Office of Sustainability, we also have now a wonderful externship program. So many of those students who are in those programs go on to be a part of our Indiana Sustainability Development Program, or ISDP, which takes students out into the real world in the summer to work in nonprofits or the public sector or even the private sector on sustainability issues. And the anecdote that I have is that we had a student move through that pathway, that scaffolding that we built, who was a climate fellow ultimately in the ISDP program, and then was hired by the city for whom he worked during his ISDP externship. He helped develop a climate resolution for that city during his ISTP externship, was then hired by the city and is now implementing that climate resolution. And this is one of the most conservative cities in the state of Indiana. And so by building that scaffolding, but through inter-campus networks, and then from campus to community networks, we built these relationships for this particular student. And I hope that I know that that's not just a one-off. I know that's happening for many of our students. So it's those kinds of relationships that I think we can build for them through that scaffolding that then ultimately helps us actually have learning outcomes, not just learning objectives, that actually fall back and address the competencies that Week developed and that we see now in the new study by Brundiers. 2 quick points at the end here. The Brundier study added 2 competencies. I mentioned that, and I meant to tell you what those are. One is intrapersonal awareness. And I love this one because it's knowing yourself and understanding your own positionality and the positionality of others. And I think that's more important than ever. And I think we've heard that a lot today. The other one is implementation competency, which some of the experts argued matched the strategic thinking competency that was already a part of Week, but others said no, implementation competency is about action. It's not just planning, it's about action. And what do we need now more than ever at this point in time in terms of climate issues is action. And it's action like that student who went on from his climate fellowship to actually become hired at that city and is now implementing, taking action to solve problems and mitigate climate change issues for that city. So that's all I have to say. Thanks for giving me time.
Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your thoughts and perspectives, and absolutely now want to know more about some of the programs and work that you're doing. And I really appreciate all of you, because I think as everyone has heard, the very different perspectives and different places that you all come from, but the interconnectedness of what you all had to share with us and how we can take that into thinking about working with students or being students, how to demand and ask for experiences that give you what you need. I'm going to go ahead and shift us to breakout groups. And so the plan from here forward is we're going to move into breakout groups. The groups are going to have roughly 15 minutes or so. But what we want you to think about, and I think it's been teed up really well, is for students who are graduating to be our climate champions or graduating in an environmental major, what should they be able to demonstrate? Like what are these main core competencies, and what learning outcomes may be the most successful in achieving those, and what obstacles might there be? So we'd like to get kind of from each of the different groups' perspectives on that, on those. So any questions on that before I send you into groups? No. Okay. Jonathan, can you send us into groups, please?
Sure thing. One moment.
Hi all. Welcome back from the breakout rooms. We'd like to use our last few minutes as just doing a kind of a quick report back and sharing of information that from each of our different breakout rooms on the question that we were tackling. So can I start with breakout room 1? And I believe, Chris, that was us.
Thanks. I was worried for a second. Well, aside from a really awesome discussion on sourdough, we talked about 2 main topics. One was this idea of information literacy and the importance of, or the difficulties or issues we face kind of in teaching this to our students. But the main thing we talked about was this kind of talk about ambiguity and we just kind of ended it with that, I thought, a really neat direction, which was how do you kind of fold in ambiguity specifically within the hard sciences, or within kind of an academic culture where students are just expecting an answer and expecting a very concrete answer, and specifically from this top-down approach from the professor. And when you kind of turn it around and offer ambiguity to students, there's sometimes a freezing moment where they don't really know how to move forward. And we didn't really have a solution to that, but I thought that for me, myself, that was a really great way just to kind of end it, was how do we actually take the steps within the classroom? And I had some perspectives from the social work profession, but I'm always eager to hear what other people have to say too. So I think that's sums it up, unless I forgot something, Beth.
No, Chris, great. Thank you very much. Group 2.
I was taking notes for group 2. I believe we were group 2. There was a point made about interpersonal competencies and reflective activity as helpful for developing like beyond interdisciplinary and interpersonal communication, personal reflection. I thought that was a beautiful point. The majority of our conversation, though, was centered around something that one of our participants identified, that there are many instances in which they've seen environmental science students graduate, and now what? They don't know where they're going to go, what career they're going to go into. And they're like, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to get a PhD now. And then you get your PhD, and what do you do with your PhD? And I think that's something that I myself have noticed too, that environmental science it doesn't really have a defined career trajectory so much as things like consulting and investment banking. And I see so many of my friends going into those kinds of careers because there's a prescribed path to success. And it's very clear. You go through the recruitment process, you get a high paying job, and then your job is pretty much, your work is cut out for you. And I think because there are so many different routes to go within environmental science that it's hard to really say with the degree in environmental science, you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And I think what we identified as lacking in climate education or environmental education is practical skill development and communication about typical career trajectories or example career trajectories, what our prominent sustainability officers of major corporations are doing and how they got there, how our major environmental lawyers got to where they are, environmental consultants, that you can be in all of these different spaces and still working within environmental science. And we just need to tell students that you can do that, and here are some ways to get there, and here are examples of what you can do right after graduation.
Great, Liliana, thank you. And I can tell you, I've heard that from students in my office as well. So I appreciate those thoughts. Group 3.
I think that was our group, and I took notes.
Okay.
Yeah. Was there somebody else who's going to speak though? Because if there's somebody else.
When you said, I think that was our group, it was my confusion. I thought you were saying Liliana was your group. It's.
Oh no, I'm group 3.
Friday confusion. You're group 3, and I'll be quiet and let Alex have the floor.
Yeah, I did take notes. Oh, sorry, my dog is getting into something. Okay, so and I'm never so great at summarizing these, so bear with me. We focused on kind of 3 different things. We talked a lot about systems thinking and how that's important, but also different ways to address systems thinking, to use really practical questions about where our resources come from, especially at the K-12 level, because we had some K-12 people in our space too. I know we're talking more university level. But we also talked about how listening is really important, and that needs to be something that people really learn how to do. And then also we talked about communication, science communication training, and how people need to be able to speak about their field to the general public, to other people who haven't studied it, and learn how to speak in ways they understand, other people understand, but also that draws them in. And I think I'm missing things, but those are kind of the three major themes that I pulled out. So if you're in my group, feel free to add anything that I missed.
I'm seeing some thumbs up from, I think, from your group members. So, okay, group 4.
So that was our group, and we forgot to designate a note taker. So I did jot some notes. I'm happy to try for our group, but then maybe I'll just ask if my group members would fill in any missing pieces for me. I think as I reflect on our discussion, I saw 2 kind of major themes that came up several times. One was really, I think that people really connected to this notion of relatives. And how is it that we build students' understanding and ways of thinking, moving from resources to thinking about relatives. And that came up in several different ways. Whether that be connected to systems thinking, so relatives are kind of part of our system. Also, one of our participants talked about how we actually are related to most other things. So we're sharing half of our DNA with mushrooms, right? And so helping to expand students' circles of compassion to include these other things that we are indeed connected to, and showing them how those connections are there and hold. And so that would be one theme that I saw. I think a second theme that came up in our group was teaching students how to maintain hope, and how to, in the words of one of our participants, how to keep engaging when it gets difficult to engage with others, how to keep their energy up, and how to ensure that they are able to maintain that hope. So that would be the 2 themes that I saw. Please, other group members, fill in any holes that I missed.
John, you're muted.
Yeah, I would say that we something that was running through what we were talking about was the recognition of the need to recognize the importance of purpose. And this is tied to hope, and it's tied to engagement as students become new professionals. That's going to give a sense of clarity. Once you determine what your purpose is, you can negotiate and navigate a lot of things that have to do with you personally and the larger world as you reflect into it. So that was also something that came up. And empathy, and added to the other competencies that Cassie had mentioned earlier, the 4 that she mentioned. We acknowledge the importance of those.
Great. So thank you, everybody. So I will say our group also talked about hope, in the sense that sometimes hope can get lost amongst ambiguity. And when you're helping students think and teaching around ambiguity, how do you maintain hope in that situation? So that was something that we talked about as well. So we have about 5 more minutes. So I'd love to just open the floor. If there's been some really great stuff that's being popped off in the chat. So let me say that we're capturing that. And one of our goals for these sessions is to for one, just begin to build a network amongst all of us that are working in this area. And part of that is sharing information and resources. So we are collecting all that. So don't feel like if you've missed something, we'll collect it and put it in one space. And names of people in this group so that we can reconnect. We can do our best with that as well. So real quick, I did want to highlight 2 things. One, John posted something earlier that I think is just really great for us to reflect on as we have these questions and discussions. And it was buried in kind of a chat comment, but I think it's worth pulling out. He said, have I become and do I embody the values and knowledge I am imparting to others? So I think that's something to really kind of think about and hold for each of us as we're thinking and having these conversations. And then I also want to highlight David brought up a question about, we were talking about environmental studies students sometimes feeling lost and without a direction. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's actually a good thing. And then maybe what we need to be redoing is helping frame and helping the students, or at least, David, let me say, I'm putting some of my interpretation on what you put. So correct me if I'm wrong. But helping our students see that just because you're not an engineer or a finance major who have very defined careers, that there's a good thing to that, and what the skills you are developing and how those can help put you in a unique position. And that's important for us to remember as we're having conversations with students that I think very naturally feel that way. Okay. So I'd love to open, if anybody wants to just, we're a small enough group, I think it's fine to just, you can just start talking. Oh, David, I think you're trying to. Do you want to turn off your mute?
Albert Einstein, he's famously said that we don't actually know what we're doing. That's why they call it research.
I see, I'm seeing several thumbs up, right? Like, and I think, you know, there is this, and Liliana will go back. I tell my students a lot, like, I don't know the answer. Like, I really don't. Like, we're in this together, and I may know a little bit more than you do, and I may have a few more skills to kind of help me dive in and process, but we're still all learning. And that is not always a comfortable place for students, I can say, or the professors sometimes either. But
yeah.
Michael.
And I would just add that telling the students, this is the answer, this is what we know, can have tremendously deleterious effects on student learning in the classroom. You really want to refrain from that.
I think that's a good point. And you know, one of the things because this last couple of minutes discussion has been right on target, I think, you know, this ambiguity question. So I think one of the things that any of you that are teaching in science, we need to disabuse our students that there's something called the scientific method. We now know there is no the scientific method. And it's that teaching that makes them think, well, if you're doing science, you got to give me the answer. And then when you can't do that, they go like, well, what good is science? Given the age we live in now and the things that we are seeing about the attack on science, we would serve ourselves quite well by letting our students know that there are many methodologies and ways of doing science. And many of those, we don't know what we're doing. It's full of ambiguity.
I was wondering if I could jump on the Einstein quoting train, but I think he said something to the effect that we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we had when we created them. And this idea of ambiguity and creative approaches and incorporating non-Western, it just needs to be in our DNA. And John, I just want to really echo that. I really appreciated your chat comment that some of this is just in how we teach and what are we doing, and really reflecting on our own approaches, because we are still guided by our biases of Western. Anyways, I could keep going, but this is my way of also just saying thank you to everybody. I've really, really appreciated this time.
I second that.
Well, and I third that. And, you know, one of the things I'm appreciating too is that I've seen some familiar faces from our conversations and the two previous conversations, and hope to you know, see your faces in the next conversation, and that this is just really the beginning of a group of us that are enjoying and learning from each other and learning how to put into practice some of the valuable tools and skills that we're talking about. So I unfortunately need to transition us towards the end. As a reminder that we have one more of our think tank sessions, and that'll be in 2 weeks from today. Just a heads up, that one will be flipped. So the workshops will be first, and then we'll close, as is the last session, we'll close with the speaker. So just remember that the workshops are flipped. Our teaching and education workshop shifts us from what do we need to teach our students, right? Which is the last 2 sessions, all students, and then specific to our environmental students. And next week, we're shifting to thinking about workforce and thinking about what skills are needed both in the workforce, do our students need to have, and what does the workforce need from us? And the title of that session is A Rising Tide Must Lift All Boats, Redefining Workforce Development in a Green Economy to Ensure a Just Transition. And then the final closing plenary speaker will be Justin Gillis, a former New York Times climate reporter. And I believe he's going to touch on some of the communication things that we have talked about as well. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for spending time on this Friday of this very long week. And I hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Yeah,
Thanks, Beth.
You're welcome. Jonathan, are you saving the chat? I have tried and it won't let me save.